Well, welcome and good morning. For those of you in the UK and Europe, good afternoon to some of you I know who've joined us from other parts of the world. Really delighted to see you here for today's session on what makes a leader credible. First, a word to thank our sponsors. We're very lucky at the FS Club to have a whole range of sponsors who support our work and enable us to run these webinars, so many thanks to them. I'm here to chair today. My name is Mike Wardle. I'm the CEO at the CN Group, and many of you will know me from such episodes before, but my job is really to get out of the way after short introductions and housekeeping to get on to our main presentation of the day. So the agenda is up on the screen. I'll get out of the way. We'll have about 20 minutes for presentation from Dr. Goodall and then a Q&A session. For those of you who haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way you ask a question is to find the question tab on the dashboard on your screen, type in your question or your observation, and when we get to the Q&A session, we'll field your questions. And do put in your observations and questions at any time during the presentation. If you have a thought, don't lose it. Put the question in. Finally, we are recording the session today, so if you need to go back and look at it again, or if you have friends and colleagues you think might be interested, the recording will be published in about 24 hours on the events page on our website. I think that does us for the housekeeping. It's a delight to welcome Dr. Amanda Goodall. She's Professor of Leadership at Bayes Business School. Her main work analysed the relationship between leadership, management and organisational performance. She obviously publishes in academic journals and publications, and her recent book, Credible, The Power of Expert Leaders, won the SABW 2023 Best in Business Book Award for Management and Leadership. She created the Executive Masters in Medical Leadership, tailored to the needs of medical doctors, and is about to launch the Executive Masters in Leadership for the Creative Industries. Amanda, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours. Over to you for your presentation this morning.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to rush through a lot of research this morning, so sorry for the speed, but it's just to try and cover as much as I possibly can. Particularly, I'm focusing on my research on expert leadership that I've been doing over the last 20 years. Perhaps you remember the miracle on the Hudson with Sully Sullenberger. Sully encountered a situation that was not in his training manual. He was leaving LaGuardia Airport and hit a flock of geese mid-air. Both engines of the Airbus stopped working. The plane was full of passengers and it turned into a very large glider flying at low altitude over a densely populated area. This was a simulation of the plane over the Hudson River. This is the actual plane over the Hudson River. Plane coming down onto the Hudson River. This is a simulation of the co-pilot and pilot. This is when it hit the water, and in fact the co-pilot actually said that when the plane hit the water it went down so deep he didn't think it was going to resurface again. It did resurface, and this is the actual plane with all the passengers saved. No one was injured at all. It was quite an extraordinary feat. How was Sully able to do this amazing thing? He had deep experience in the core business of flying. He'd flown for the American Air Force. He'd done many training, taught on many training programs. But at this point, his intuition took over at that particular moment. And there was a great quote from him, which I think sums up and is a good start for this talk. For 42 years, I've been making small regular deposits in a bank of experience. On January 15, 2009, the balance was sufficient that I could make a very large withdrawal. So why is it relevant to you? I believe that expertise in the world has been devalued. This has happened since the mid-20th century. Prior to that, leaders and managers had experience, years of experience, and tended to work their way up an industry. And I think part of this problem is actually down to business schools, and we'll come back to that. Now, again, possibly we're always in turbulent times, but particularly now with AI, with climate change coming at us, global conflict, much in terms of technological advances, I think experts are even more important than they possibly have been in the past. There was an expansion of generalists that moved into leadership en masse. With them came managerialism, bureaucracy and benchmarks, metrics, and performance measures replaced domain-specific judgment. You can see this in the healthcare, you can see it in universities, possibly in some of your private industries it's less evident, but it's certainly evident in many places. I don't know whether any of you ever saw this cartoon in the New Yorker. To me, it says two things. First, it's about the political populism, the rise of political populism that we're all evidencing now, the rejection of the so-called elitist and liberals, and it targets the left behind, the poor and socially marginalised. But there was there's another group who I think warmed to this message, and that's politicians and possibly some big businesses also. Experts can be very annoying. They won't do as they're told, which can get in the way of political power and also sometimes corporate power. Experts are governed by others who are very similar to themselves, standards, regulations, extensive education, experience and certification. They may be investors, lawyers, or fashion designers. Management consultants, I would argue, and generalist managers tend to be a lot more pliable, which is why very often they are put in senior leadership positions, say by politicians. And we maybe can talk about that later. So what happens when non-experts fly the plane? This is an example that many of you may be aware of. Andy Hornby, his undergraduate degree was in English literature at Oxford University. He started his career in a cement business before moving to Asda Supermarket, where he joined the board at the very early age of 32. In 1999, he became chief executive of Halifax Retail. In 2001, in a 28 billion merger with the Bank of Scotland, as you will all no doubt know, HBOS was formed. Hornby was chief operating officer in 2005, and just 1 year later, at age 39, he became CEO of HBOS. The merged HBOS was one of the largest financial institutions in Europe. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this call. Hornby embarked on an ambitious expansion strategy, as many did at that time. Instead of sort of possibly focusing on sound long-term business goals, he pushed the bank to pursue riskier loans to maximize short-term benefits. And he wasn't the only person who did that. Many financial institutions did it at that time. As we all know, it ended in disaster. 50,000 jobs at the time were lost, and in 2008 the UK's taxpayers extended to Lloyds and HBOS a 20 billion bailout. On February 20th in 2009, a British government Treasury Select Committee questioned the 4 British bankers responsible for the fate of HBOS. And again, many of you may remember this. Nick Ainger, who was a member of Parliament, a Welsh member of Parliament, asked what seemed to me to be a very important question. What banking qualifications have you got, Mr. Hornby? I did not have any formal banking qualifications, responds Mr. Hornby. I have an MBA from Harvard Business School, where I specialised in all the finance courses, including financial services. Neither Hornby nor the other senior bankers had any formal qualifications. So what happens when experts are ignored? Boeing pre-sold 350 of its 787 Dreamliner aircraft in 2005. Dreamliner was light and it was seen to be very advanced. It used far less fuel. But the thing about this new system was that it relied very heavily on outsourcing in order to make the build cheaper. This unfortunately ended in disaster. 60% of Dreamliner's design, engineering and manufacture, as I said, was outsourced, but to 50 strategic partners. And this made it very hard for the engineers to be able to control the process. Dreamliner was supposed to come in under budget. Unfortunately, it went way over budget and incurred numerous delays. And in 2013, the FAA grounded all 50 of Boeing's 787 Dreamliners after battery fires in 2 planes. Did Boeing learn from this Dreamliner experience? Unfortunately not. In 2018, Boeing's 737 MAX crashed in Indonesia. A second MAX crashed a year later in 2019 in Ethiopia, and sadly all passengers and crew lost their lives. There was a culture change when McDonnell Douglas took over Boeing, and this was documented in an excellent article in the New Yorker. And James Surowiecki did intense research on what had happened in Boeing. He said the executives were obsessed with cost-cutting, outsourcing, and ignoring warnings from their engineers. He wrote, the nerds may have been running the show in Silicon Valley, but at Boeing, they were increasingly marginalized by the bean counters. Boeing were charged with 2.5 billion fines over the MAX incident, and unfortunately things had continued to turn out very badly for Boeing. We are, I believe, on the brink potentially of another extinction, and I think, again, we are not listening to the experts. So moving on to the formal research, as was mentioned, it's all published in this book, which is a kind of more readable version of all my research articles. So my expert leadership research asks, how much core business knowledge should our senior leaders, our CEOs, and our line managers have? Importantly, I've kind of worked against the sort of, tried to avoid anecdote as far as I can, and most of my work is used, is done through looking for statistical patterns, which I believe are generalizable now across many different sectors. And I try to use longitudinal data where possible. So does it matter to the performance of Mercedes-Benz, for example, that its former head had started in the company in '76, stayed 43 years and had a PhD in engineering? How relevant is it that the world's most valuable apparel brand, Nike, was created by two competitive runners? One was a middle distance runner and his coach was a former Olympic medalist, Bill Bowman. This is just a list of companies I'm just going to throw up here, which are all started by people who had varying degrees of knowledge in the organizations that they created, but they all had knowledge in those areas. Similarly here, Starbucks, he knew he had to become a deep expert in coffee, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into these details, but I'll throw them up and you're very welcome to the slides. Martin Gilbert, who'll be speaking at Bayes in a few weeks' time. Another person who had a deep experience in fund management and investment operations. So another area of research I've looked at is healthcare. Does it matter, for example, if the CEO of a hospital is a doctor as opposed to a non-medically trained manager? So there's two institutions that are the number one and number two in the world, year in, year out, is the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic. These are always number one and two, doesn't matter what ranking, and it seems to be continuously so. The nice thing about both of these healthcare institutions is that they have only ever been led by doctors. In other words, causality, there is no problem identifying causality. They've only ever been led by doctors. I started my research actually working with two different leaders of research universities. I came to university late. I did my PhD late after having worked with two leaders. One after working in London School of Economics with Tony Giddens, and the other one was at Warwick University. And my PhD I did at Warwick Business School, and my research question, based on what I'd observed going back many, many years, was who should lead research universities? Should they essentially be good managers or good scholars? So I found that the best universities in the world are led by top scholars, and in longitudinal data, which was really important to show, in other words, did Harvard put a top scholar on after they became a top university? I found that top scholars actually improve the later performance of their university. This was my, and I've also shown this for business schools, and I've also got a study looking at heads of departments across a number of US economics departments, and we found exactly the same thing. The better the researcher, the better the performance of the business school and the academic department, and indeed the university. This was all published in 2009, my PhD by Princeton University Press. But what do headhunters often look for? Well, in my world, this is a recurring thing. It comes up every few years. In 2014, these headhunters questioned whether academics were the bright leaders of tomorrow for higher education. With no evidence whatsoever, they made the claim that universities needed leaders with skills honed in the business world. If those in charge of Stanford University had taken the advice of Odgers, I think the world would probably have been a very different place. Silicon Valley is run by experts, give or take the odd bank, but it was also entirely created by academic experts from Stanford University, as many of you will know. Frederick Terman was an extraordinary research engineer. He had 36 patents to his name. He was decorated in World War II by both the Americans and the British, and he was a highly cited scholar. Prior to World War II, Terman convinced the university to set aside some land on the Stanford campus to allow industry to work in closer proximity with the engineers at the university. In 1951, when he was Dean of the School of Engineering, he launched the Stanford Industrial Park, which of course we all now know as Silicon Valley. If Terman was the founding father of Silicon Valley, it was John Hennessy who cemented its status and relationship with tech companies. Hennessy was president of Stanford for 16 years, and he's another very highly cited scientist and engineer, and virtually all our tablets and devices have got some architecture in that was developed by Hennessy and his collaborator Patterson. As we know, Stanford's faculty, graduates, alumni, etc., have created over 40,000 companies since the 1930s. In which other empirical settings have we identified the expert leader findings? So basketball, in a study with two economists, one at Cornell who had great data on coaches. We looked at longitudinal data and used information from 15,000 basketball games. We found that star basketball players and those with long playing careers went on to make the best basketball coaches. Formula One racing, again, another study that we did because for me it was very important to try and get as many data sets as possible to test this hypothesis in them. We looked at the performance of every team in 6 decades of Formula One racing between 1950 and 2011. We found the most successful team leaders in F1 were more likely to have started their careers as drivers. 10 years driving experience was equal to a 16% higher probability that a leader's team gained a podium position. And this is a picture, of course, as everyone will recognize, of Lewis Hamilton. When he was about 6, 7, he started driving around tracks at speeds that most of us will never do in our lives. And you can imagine after all the years he's been in vehicles, you know, his engineering, his skills, his etc. will have accumulated to an extraordinary extent. We find the same result in football. Healthcare is an area that I did, again, I got a load of data from an American hospital ranking, and I put this very simple question in 2011. It was one of the earlier papers I did. Are hospitals ranked high when they are led by doctors or professional managers? I found in that ranking, and this is from 2 different studies, in both cases, hospital quality scores are approximately 25% higher in physician-run hospitals. And these findings, many people now, after me, many people have moved into this area looking at physician leadership. So this was an interesting paper just to sort of summarize to close the summary of the research, some of this research. This was looking at every single CEO in Denmark, so 30,000 companies over 18 years, so great longitudinal data, so we could look at literally all different kinds of companies. And we found again that the performance return is significantly higher if a company is led by an expert leader, by someone who really understands the core business. What I'm going to now talk to you about is how this happens. We find that employees are less likely to leave a firm, and they report higher job satisfaction when their boss understands what they're doing. And we found it in this study, again with 2 economists in 2016. We had 35,000 US and UK employees who were matched with their employers. And we found 3 critical influences on job satisfaction when employees were managed by a supervisor who could perform an employee's job, if the line manager worked his or her way up the company or started it, and a supervisor's level of technical competence as judged by his or her employees. All 3 of these are predictive of substantially greater levels of happiness among employees. And this is an important diagram. It was an important diagram for me. It shows that having a boss who is, what in my jargon, an expert leader, is worth approximately double your job satisfaction compared to your pay. So it's more important than your pay. The fact that you've got a good boss matters more than your education, what sector you work in, your tenure, and importantly, your pay. This was a really important finding for us. So 6 countries, 6 data sets. We've looked at this in lots of different data sets, and we found if you have a line manager who is an expert boss, you are more likely to report high job satisfaction and low intentions to quit. Now, why is employee job satisfaction so important? I think we're all aware of this now, and numerous studies have shown that happy workers are more productive workers, and that is linked through a number of studies to organizational performance also. And of course, the media uses this all the time. Best places to work rankings are ubiquitous. Our research reveals that on average, having a line manager and a CEO who are experts in the core business has huge benefits to employees and organizational performance. So how do expert line managers raise performance? Again, I'm summarizing from many papers here. Expert managers give better feedback. You can imagine if they understand what you're doing and they understand it to a high level, they can give you feedback on what you're doing. Better employee career development and progression is found. They're more consultative and can act as a career mentor. By setting appropriate goals for employees, you can assess how the kind of goals that an employee is capable of if you understand the job yourself. And employees are more likely to trust the organization's senior management. This was we found in a study of doctors, interestingly. There's higher staff retention and reduced quits. And we've got a paper that's just about to come out showing that in the NHS, where staff are draining out of the organization, we can actually show that both clinical and non-clinical staff are more likely to leave if they have a bad line manager. Importantly, they are credible to followers. So how do expert CEOs raise performance? So this is looking at the top of the organization. And again, this is through evidence. They often can signal a clear purpose that shapes the organizational strategy, which is, of course, aligned with the core business. They tend to take a longer view, and many studies have found that expert bosses are more likely to invest in R&D. Commitment to excellence, not just to quarterly returns. They are more likely to encourage innovation if they really understand the core business. If they're technical and they understand the technical business, they're more likely to encourage employees to be innovative. They know what good looks like. I think that's really important. If you've reached a very high level yourself, you can see in others what the best looks like, and that therefore sets the level for hiring standards that tends to go up, and also internal promotion. This was a guy, Patrick Harker, who is now actually working in finance, but he was Dean of Wharton Business School when I interviewed him, and he said something that I thought was really important, and I cite him often. A leader sets the standard for an organization, and to be credible, the standard bearer must first bear the standard. So just summarizing quickly before I stop, experts still need leadership development. I'm not saying that you can just be an expert. I'm not dragging out a scientist from a lab and bunging them on top of an organization. Experts need leadership development, and possibly even more than generalists, because they focus very deeply in one area. They may be hubristic, etc. So this is expert leadership plus leadership management development. But I believe that leadership development should not be generic. I think that business schools have been peddling generic leadership programs for way too long. I think they should be now tailored to suit different professions. Different professions have different, and we know this, evidence shows there's different personality types, there's different cognitive levels, there's different learning styles. And I think we as business schools need to tailor our learning, which is what I've been doing. I've been running the Executive Master in Medical Leadership for nearly 10 years now. And we have got extraordinary outcomes data showing doctors going into leadership positions and how they are using their learning as reported by their line managers. Because this is another thing for me, in terms of leadership development, there's a lot of people that offer leadership development programs. Again, they're somewhat ubiquitous, but who's actually evidencing the outcomes? How do we know they're actually working? Well, we can do that with the medical leadership one. And we're also looking, as was suggested, we've got creative industries and education and also hospitality coming up also. So I'm going to stop there. That's the book that's got everything in it, and I will stop sharing, I think, now as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda, and you condensed an awful lot of content into a short time. Those of you who are really interested will go and I'm sure find more of Amanda's research and writing. We've got quite a few questions already in. I'm going to start with quite a general one. Robert McDowell asked, does leadership now really focus on style rather than substance? And of course, style follows fashion. Where's the trend in leadership?
I guess I would say that what I'm trying to do is move away from the trend stuff about leadership, and the style of leadership may be about, is important, and we teach that. Behavior is the first module that we offer our students, 4 days of behavioral training. But in terms of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move away from anecdotal leadership discussions, from these kind of wild theories that sometimes people in my field can come up with, and I just want to focus on the evidence. What does the evidence say about behaviors, but about the kind of leaders that are best for individuals? So I'm not quite sure. In terms of style, we do style when we do the behavioral training, but I think for me it's really moving away from anecdote and moving more and really focusing on evidence. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I think it does. John Knights has picked up on this question of expertise and training, suggesting that decision making should be made or should be delegated to experts. But expertise, he says, isn't enough. How do we develop self-awareness, emotional intelligence, ethics, values, a good sense of intuition? How do we train people to make the right decisions and involve people around them, rather than simply base it on their existing knowledge?
So no one's ever suggesting that it's based just on their knowledge. Everyone needs to have training in leadership and management, absolutely. And I would say you can, from my experience of training doctors over the last decade, I can give doctors extraordinary amounts of training, and we do. I can't give a non-doctor the experience, the patient focus, the education, the years of experience of working in healthcare that doctors have got. So what I would say is it's very possible to give experts leadership and management skills. You can't give non-experts all the knowledge that experts have got. So I would say number one. Number two, the way I start each kind of new cohort of doctors is I say to them, we can give you health analytics, strategy, finance, etc. But if you behave like an asshole, no one's ever going to follow you. So the first 4 days are very intensive. It's all about behavior. It's all about emotional intelligence. But we have a very senior doctor from Cleveland Clinic who talks about emotional intelligence. So we actually try and bring in people who are relevant to them as well. But the first 4 days, we hold a mirror up to them, and they really examine their behaviors and their leadership styles and their communication, and that's number one. And that runs throughout the whole 2 years of the program. Actually, we have given them a coach, we put them in action learning. Behavior is first and foremost on that degree. So I completely agree. What I don't agree with is people often say you can't train experts to do this stuff, and I think that's BS. I'm afraid. I think experts are very capable of learning those skills. As capable as if I randomly went out and picked a load of people from the street. I think that they're just as well, except for they've got often a doctor has been trained for years, well, the longest training of anything in the UK, to think about the patient. Now, that's where their heart is. That's where their decision making comes from. That's the core business of medicine is healing patients. So I would say that can't be, that's come from their training. That no general manager will ever have that.
Thank you. Nick Bush kind of extends this a little bit, saying there seems to be a view that people with deep expertise pay less attention to soft skills, those things that help create successful organisational culture. I just wonder whether you have any reflections on how the organisations and leaders you studied enable positive cultures as part of their success.
I think the stuff that we have existed that we've realised from the research, and I completely agree with you, by the way, that there is this assumption that somehow, I get this thrown up a lot, that somehow we must be excluding soft skills, or that doctors or that lawyers or that excludes or entrepreneurs. Now we all know that there are a few, I won't mention any names, but some of them coming out of Silicon Valley that I was talking about earlier, who are pretty narcissistic, and you wouldn't necessarily want to work with them. Indeed, the United States is ruled by someone right now of a very similar vein. And I have a PhD student who is working on narcissistic tendencies of some entrepreneurs and how that relates to their whole leadership kind of pathway. But yeah, from my evidence working with doctors, they are extraordinarily open to changing their behavior, to examining their behavior, to the soft skills. I've never ever seen, anyone who I've never come across people who aren't. That doesn't mean it's not difficult. And for people who have focused very narrowly down one lens, or maybe have a certain mindset that's very focused on their expertise, it might take a little time to help them realize what's going on. But I would never say that an expert is less aware or less sensitive to soft skills, and I agree with that comment absolutely. I'm not sure if the culture. So just going back onto the research, so what we find is that that if you work with someone who's your line manager, or in a team with someone who really understands what you're doing, all our evidence suggests that that person is much more likely to create a work environment that is conducive to your performance, conducive to keeping the conditions sensitive to what you need as as an employee. So the worst cases we find is when someone doesn't understand what what the people they are line managing are doing, and to a great extent they are the ones who can create an atmosphere that is really very challenging, because they have no empathy with what I'm doing. I don't mean that empathy in a kind of kindness way. I mean, they just don't understand what I'm doing. So how are they ever going to create the right work environment for me? It's like me creating an environment for a tortoise. If I haven't studied them and understand what a tortoise needs to live in, I'm not going to create a good home for a tortoise.
Thank you for that. Douglas Adams, just picking up on the sort of US position, just mentions the question of the president of Columbia University, obviously a top scholar, former head of the LSE, who had to resign in the political circumstances that occur. And a question, we don't want to generalize from a specific, but are there things that expert leaders perhaps struggle with when they're dealing with the external environment, or is that simply the luck of the draw?
Well, can I say that's a very good example, because she was not a top scholar, actually. She was really a civil servant. She worked in finance. I know she was on the Monetary Policy Committee. She was really a finance person. She was not someone that any of us could relate to as an academic, actually, funnily enough. So, and I would say she wasn't very focused on the academy when she was at LSE. I wasn't at LSE when she was there, but I know that that's what I've heard from other colleagues of mine from there. So I wouldn't say that she was a top scholar by any means. Do they struggle? I think the situation she found herself in at Columbia was extremely difficult. And I think anyone at any university in the United States right now is struggling terribly. A conflict with I don't need to spell that out, but I think it's probably the worst time for universities in the United States. The United States has been the standard bearer for the top institutions in the world, and they are being crucified right now, and that is really, really sad, by someone who basically looks down on expertise. But yes, going back to the good question, there's, of course, in the external environment there are situations that are going to be very challenging for anyone at the top of an organization, and I suppose one of the ways that you have to always manage external environments that are changing, that are going through turbulent times or calm times or whatever it happens to be. But I think it's better if the person at the head understands how to keep things moderately calm and rolling over for the people inside. You want that person to be able to put their arms around the organization, to understand the bulk of the employees that they have in their organization, and try and maintain process, calmness, productivity under these very difficult conditions. Now, there's always going to be challenges with the external environment, of course, and people aren't necessarily going to be you know, if you're a head of an engineering company, you're not necessarily going to be expert in managing political, you know, whatever's going on in the politics. But I do still think it's much better for the people in the organization. You know, we're facing this now in universities. Universities are losing money on every undergraduate they have in this country. We haven't been financing, you know, we haven't been putting tax money into universities for a long time. But it's much better to think that your president or your dean of your school is looking, you know, is looking after your interests and fighting your corner. Now, if they don't understand your interests and they don't know exactly how to defend your corner, that's not going to be good for the employees.
Thank you for that. Matthew Leach just asked a very simple question. How have non-experts managed to be so credible? You mentioned HBOS in your remarks, but how is it we've got to that position?
Yes, I mean, I would question that they have become credible, but yeah, that's a very good point, and they have had a lot of power. So I think from what I've observed and stuff that we've seen, I'll give you an example from universities, which is where I first started the study. There's a scholar saying, all done your PhDs, all going into, you know, get your tenure if you're in America, get your contract if you're in the UK. But there's a number of people who either their research isn't really hitting with the world, or they're not that interested in it, or they've had challenges. So they think, I'm concerned, I'm not necessarily going to be promoted from my research. I think I'll do a sideways move, and I'll do some management training, and I'll run universities instead. I'll go into the administration instead. And that's how I think a lot of people do this. Not all, but I have seen, we have cases of nurses who were not great nurses who went in to become nurse managers, and it didn't work out very well often. And you know, what you don't want is people who aren't good at the core business. You don't want some doctor who's a shit doctor and damaging your patients to then become a leader. That's an extreme example, but that process has happened. I've seen it a lot in universities. That wouldn't happen in somewhere like Deloitte's, and it's quite interesting that management consultancies, the big management consultancies, there is no way in hell that I could go and get a job in Deloitte's and, you know, and apply for a top senior position in McKinsey, Deloitte's, or anywhere else. You basically fall out of the womb in the bracement, as far as I've researched, and you work your way up in the organization. All of the people in these top firms have been practicing expert leadership forever. Having said that, and this goes back to the question a bit, they do not preach what they practice. I don't see them going into hospitals, and I have numerous stories from doctors about major consulting firms going into British NHS hospitals and really not understanding what the hell is going on at all. That wouldn't happen. They're never going to allow a doctor to go into Deloitte and tell them how to run things. So how has that happened? Partly because these big management consultancies have validated generalist knowledge in a way. And I think that if you look at the NHS, many of the general CEOs and non-clinical CEOs are more likely to use management consultancies than others. The bill is going up again, unfortunately. And I think business schools have to take our responsibility. Obviously, Frederick Taylor, when he moved onto mass productivity, he looked to basically the brains of the managers, the brawn of the workers, and separated that expert knowledge from the frontline workers. Japanese car manufacturers have not done that, or didn't, you know, they kept the old ways. But I think business schools have created MBAs and generalist management degrees, and I'm not against an MBA. I think an MBA can be a great degree, so I don't want to put MBAs down at all, but I don't believe that you can do an MBA like Andy Hornby and then, you know, and then basically go and run any organization that you want. And that has been a culture that I believe has been permeated over the last sort of, I don't know, 50, 60 years, whatever. We've been building up to that. I think we need to move away from that now and go right back to expertise. But generalists are powerful. They can spend a lot of time learning the soft skills, learning communication skills, doing that kind of stuff. And then they can talk. They can really talk the talk. They just can't do the walking, but they're very good. So they'll make an expert look like a, you know, communication dinosaur, because they're just not all glossy and can't explain things in that way. And I think generalists have spent a lot more time on their personal development than many experts, and that's why until I die, I intend to train as many experts as I can in leadership and management skills so that they can really compete.
Thank you for that. Simona Kiriakou has noted, not only do people who are bad at their jobs get promoted, some people who are great at their jobs get promoted into management, and suck at it. Simona says that is the technical term. How do you select the right people to move into leadership, I guess?
Yeah, in the book, actually, I'm not wanting to discuss that particularly, push it, but it's just that I do go into a lot of detail about that. Whereas in the academic papers, it's not as obviously gone through. But in the book, I'm able to look at what the army does. I'm able to look at certain institutions of what they do. So the army has this very interesting process, which probably everyone in this call knows that leadership management training actually originally came from the army. There was a good reason that the Romans managed to convert things in this country. They didn't do it through anarchy, they did it through some leadership training. But in the army they have this thing called theatres of observation, and that's the idea is that you see people with others, and then you can kind of spot and develop the people that look like they have a kind of natural propensity towards management, communication. They have empathy, relationships with people, whatever it happens to be, and then they will develop them. I think for companies, for universities, for any organization, taking the long view is massively important. And I know in a way the culture's changed like that. People jump in and out of organizations much more, but spotting and developing individuals when you see them in this kind of setting and you think that person could be good, I think is really important. Giving them the tools, then the right tools, training them and helping them through their career. I think that's a really, really important way of doing it. And I do go into a lot of detail on that in the book, but just to summarize for the sake of time.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions I think we can fit in the time we have. Nigel Cairns comes from the opposite direction. He works in IT, and he's 30 years in, but he started in the military and doesn't have the expertise and technical delivery that the people working for him do. His role, as he says, as a servant leader is to set clear purpose, care about the team, ensure they have what they need to do their jobs and to realise their potential. How does that form of leadership fit with your definition of sort of expert leaders?
Yeah, I mean, just firstly to say, obviously, I'm in the game of finding proper empirical patterns in data. Now, that doesn't mean that every single expert's going to be a great leader, and it doesn't mean that every single generalist is not going to be. I think from what I'm hearing from that question, it sounds like he's very aware of what he's good at and very aware of what he's not good at. In other words, what I would say is if very often there will be times when you can't find an expert, you can't hire an expert, you can't promote an expert into a particular position. Therefore, you have to have someone who maybe not directly have the expertise. And I think that can be fine, as long as that person knows what they don't know, as long as that person is aware that they can't advise on a strategy that's going to fundamentally change, the technical direction of an organization without having, people around them and giving power to people around them who are the technical experts, so that they can, that this person is surrounded by a core of experts who can advise what can and can't be done, and who work very closely and who can fundamentally speak up about when things are right and when things are wrong. So I think that can absolutely work. And it sounds like, and he's come from a military background, so he would have had no doubt great training, but it's being aware, being very aware, not being hubristic, thinking, I was a great lawyer, I'm pretty shit hot at everything actually. And we can see that. It's having humility, it's knowing what you do know, what you don't know, what you need others to help you with. I think that's absolutely fundamental. Humility really is what we're talking about here. And that humility is always helpful, I think, for leaders, whether they're experts or not.
Well, thank you so much. There's a few questions we haven't got to. We might send them to you, if we may, by email afterwards, just so that if you want to pick up, you can. So just to close, first of all, thanks again to our sponsors. It's really great that we're able to offer such interesting content with your support. Forthcoming event on the 23rd of October, Thursday, we have a webinar, Shaping Taiwan into Asia's Asset Management Center, live from Taipei. On Thursday next week, we're launching the Global Green Finance Index 16th edition, and on 13th of November, we have a session on the big problem, why most music never leaves the bedroom. So lots of interesting content coming up. Just remains me to offer some thanks, first of all, to you, the audience, for turning up and being with us, and for your excellent questions and engagement. But most of all, to Dr. Amanda Goodall, thank you so much for your stimulating presentation. It's really interesting, and I hope lots of people will be following up by reading some more of your work. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.